Today, a story about war, rabbits, and some dastardly molecules. We start back in 1943 when the Germans raided a fleet of ships at a harbor in Italy, the harbor of Bari. And there was terrible devastation. The bombs fell on the planes. The sailors had to jump into the water. There was already burning oil. Terrible scenario. But you know what? There are many stories that say that that incident began the age of chemotherapy. A captivating story, except it isn't exactly like that. During the First World War, mustard gas was introduced. Mustard gas is a very simple molecule. A sulfur atom joined to two carbons on each side and a couple of chlorine atoms. It causes blisters, it impairs breathing, it can kill you very quickly. Well, some autopsies were done after the First World War on soldiers who had died from mustard gas, and something interesting was discovered. They had very low white blood cell counts. The mustard gas was doing something to their bone marrow. Well, that was pretty interesting. And the devastation was so great with these poison gases in the First World War that an agreement was signed in Geneva to ban the use of all chemical weapons. But the Americans were suspicious that the Germans would not play by the rules as the Second World War loomed. And they undertook a research project at Yale University to study the effects of mustard gas to see if you could find a way to combat it. Well, the researchers there, Goodman and Gilman, had heard that the Germans were working on an altered version of mustard gas. Instead of a sulfur atom in the middle here, they had a nitrogen atom in the middle. Otherwise, the molecule was pretty well the same. But that was supposed to be much more dangerous, much more toxic. So they were doing research with that. And part of this research involved injecting some of the material into rabbits to see what the effect would be. Well, it turned out that the effect was on lymphoid tissue. And then Goodman and Gilman thought, gee, if the effect is on lymphoid tissue, maybe lymphoid tumors could be affected, could be treated with mustard gas. And it turned out that that was correct. They took quite some ribbing from their colleagues about this because they said that the Germans were not likely to attack with hypodermic syringes, which is what was used on the rabbits. Anyway, the tumors regressed, and eventually it was even tried on a human. And indeed, a man who had a lymphoid tumor did very well, except that the tumor came back. The process was repeated again and again, and eventually it failed, so they stopped the whole project. But then, just a few months later, after this project was stopped, in 1943, the bombing took place on the harbor at Bari. And the sailors had to jump into the water with burning oil. But it turned out that the survivors suffered another problem. They had blisters. They had breathing impairment. It turned out that they were suffering from mustard gas poisoning. No, the Germans hadn't dropped it, but one of the ships had been carrying mustard gas. Now, mustard gas is not actually a gas. It's a liquid. It volatilizes very easily. But it spilled into the water, and these soldiers were affected. And the doctors found that they had low levels of white blood cells. So now researchers put together this incident with the one that had been going on in Yale University, the research, and they began to investigate whether or not this novel version of the mustard gas with the nitrogen in it was effective in the treatment of disease. And it turned out that it was effective in the treatment of some cancers. And that was seized upon, and different versions of the mustard gas were made, and that led to the modern chemotherapeutic use in cancer. Things like cyclophosphamide, which is widely used, can all be traced back to then. But the idea that all of this began with the bombing at Bari, and the accidental discovery of low white blood cells in the survivors, that is not actually true. That did not start chemotherapy. As I said, the research had been going on before the war, and that is where it originally germinated. Nevertheless, it is a fascinating story, but war is a bad business.